الحمد لله وكفى والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولله على الناس حج البيت من استطاع إليه سبيلا سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. So we've been speaking about the Umrah, and yesterday we covered a few of the major acts, and now we're going to complete it. So remember that there are four major acts that are sort of constitute the Umrah. The first is Tawaf, the second is Salat Maqam Ibrahim, the third is Sa'i, and the fourth is cutting or shaving the hair. Now, we talked about Tawaf yesterday, and we talked about Salat Maqam Ibrahim. We talked about, interacting with the water of Zamzam. And now what we're going to do is talk about a wajib act of Umrah called Sa'i. Basically what this act involves is moving between the Safa and Marwa 7 times. And we'll talk about this in more detail. And again, all of this is going to be done in a state of ihram. Okay, so Sa'i is a name of, actually literally it means to run. And it refers to moving between the place where Hazrat Hawa alayhi salam ran back and forth. Hajra. Where Hazrat Hajra, that's not, it's correct on the slide, ran back and forth in order to seek water for her child. In the Sharia, what actually occurs is that you have to go 7 times between these 2 mountains, and that constitutes this act called Sa'i. Alright, now I mentioned yesterday that what you're going to do is you're going to go back to the black stone, Hajar Aswad, and it's mustahab to do istilam, and that's going to be your 9th total. That's what we concluded with yesterday, so now I'm just tying this back into yesterday. Alright, then you're going to proceed to Safa. Now, when you proceed to Safa, what you're going to do is you're going to look for that green light that I mentioned on the wall, which was opposite the black stone, and you're going to walk now towards that green light and go outside of the area of Tawaf. As you head towards that green light and leave the area of Tawaf, you'll actually be approaching this mountain. And as you approach this mountain, which really isn't a mountain, it's actually a little bit of a hill. It's all now kind of paved and it's very easy to walk through. It's actually connected part of the masjid. As you approach this area, this raised area, you're going to say the following line. Abdul bima bada Allahu bihi, that I begin with that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala began with. Inna as-safa wal marwata min sha'airillah. And then you're going to recite this portion of the ayah. Now verily Safa wal Marwa are from the signs of Allah subhanahu, the manifest signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, then you'll actually approach the mountain, and it's not really a mountain again. It's more like this little raised area. It's more like a hill, you can say. And you'll see that it's a stony hill. So as you approach this stony hill, you will climb up it, and in such a way that the Kaaba is visible. Now you're going to be looking through all the pillars of the masjid in order to get a clear, or in order to get some sort of sight of the Kaaba. But once you actually see it, then you're going to make the niyyah for Sa'i. Now recognize that there's limited space on this hill, and everybody's trying to do the same thing. They're all trying to see the Kaaba, so you may not get the best vision of it, but if you can just get a glimpse of it, then you're going to make the niyyah. Now, the niyyah is that same type of niyyah that we've talked about for each of these acts. So in this case, it's Allahumma inni uridu as-sa'ya bayna as-safa wal marwa. That oh Allah, verily I intend moving between Safa wal Marwa, between the 2 mountains, sab'ata ashwat. I'm going to do this 7 times, lillahi azza wa jal, in the name of Allah, or for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the same thing, so make it easy for me and accept it from me. So here the general theme every time that you're making the niyyah is the same thing. Oh Allah, I intend to do this act in your name, so make it easy for me and accept it from me. And you can make this niyyah in any language. Alright, now once you have made the niyyah, the next thing will be that you will face the direction of the Kaaba, whether you can see it or not, depending on where you're standing. And you'll raise both hands to your shoulder, right, as if you're making dua. Now you raise both hands up as if you're making dua, and then you're going to say, Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. You'll say that 3 times. So Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. And then you're going to make salawat. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad wa barik wa sallim. Then what you're supposed to do is make dua for a few minutes. And if you look in the books of fiqh, they say, about the amount of time it takes to read 20, 25, 30 ayat. So you're really supposed to actually stand there and make some significant amount of dua due to the blessing of this place. Now, remember that if you go back historically, this was the place where movement between the 2 mountains was done in search of water, or in search of some sort of food for the baby. And what you're going to do when you write at this point is, remember, you want to make dua in context. So the contextual dua here will be that, oh Allah, through the initial sa'i that occurred between these 2 mountains, you raised up a spring of water that has out of a dry, barren desert, that has quenched the thirst of millions and millions of people. So Ya Allah, in the same way, as I move between these 2 mountains, raise a well from my heart, from the barren desert of my heart, that will quench my own thirst and that will quench the thirst of the people that I interact with, or something of that nature. So again, it's always you're making dua in context. Make dua for forgiveness, make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your act. But basically this is a place to stand and make dua. Now, once you make this dua, then you're going to head towards Marwa. And you'll see that actually it's very similar to, the setup is very similar to what you might see in a large airport. So if you go to like O'Hare Airport, you have a big right lane where people are going towards the gates, and you have a big left side where people are coming back from the gates when you go between the big terminals. So it's very similar in that there's a whole big right lane where people are all heading towards Marwa. And then there's a whole big left lane that people are coming back towards Safa. So what you're going to do is get in the right lane, and you'll see you can't miss it. All the crowd is going together up that lane. And then you're going to recite adhkar, make dua, etc. Now, there isn't any particular thing that you need to recite when you do this act, but there is one dua that is most suggested, right? And that's the following: Rabbi ghfir warham, antal a'azzul akram. So this is the dua that you want to, or the dhikr that you want to keep abundant while you're making the sa'i. All right. As you proceed through the sa'i, you're going to notice that there is an area marked by 2 green lights. So there'll be a green light, and then there'll be a length of the sa'i, and then there'll be another green light. So what you'll notice is that people will be walking, and right when they come to that green light, they'll begin to run. And then when they come to the other green light, they'll slow down, and then they'll begin to walk again. And so it is for males only that between those 2 green lights you should quicken your pace and run slowly. So keep that in mind as well. That's one point to keep in mind. Now once you arrive at Marwa, it's going to be the same thing. So you're going to climb up the mountain slightly. You're going to try to see if you can find the Kaaba, try to look at it. At least face its direction, and then repeat the exact same thing. You're going to repeat the same adhkar, right, which we had here. Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. You'll make salawat on the Prophet ﷺ, make dua for a few minutes, and then you'll then go back towards Safa. Now once you go towards from Safa to Marwa, that counts as 1 lap. When you come back from Marwa to Safa, that counts as your 2nd lap. So you're going to start at Safa and end up at Marwa. Alright. Now here's a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one is that it's sunnah to not take a break in between tawaf and sa'i. So remember that although we took a break in the lecture, right, we did tawaf and then we took a break and now we're doing sa'i, it's sunnah to not take a break. So you're not going to take a break in between. But it is permissible if you're tired. So sometimes it happens that you're completely fatigued, especially when you do this. You're going to do this again after Hajj for those people who are doing tamattu'. You're going to come back and do another tawaf and another sa'i, and I'll tell you that is a really tiresome thing. It's very tiring. It's very tiring to after you finish that tawaf, you are basically knocked out, and you'll hear stories about young people getting dehydrated and people who are so energetic and exercise regularly, they just pass out, and so it's really not as easy as you might think. So it is permissible to take a break if you need to, but it's not the sunnah. When you're doing the sa'i, the same question that arose when you were doing tawaf can also arise in the sa'i, in that you get confused about the number of rounds. It's a little bit harder to get confused because obviously you're going from one place and coming back to another place. You're not walking in a circle. So you can pretty much figure out where you are. But if you're unsure, go down to the lower number. Now if by accident you make a mistake and you don't know which one is Safa and which one is Marwa, and you start at Marwa, then that round doesn't count. So you really need to figure out where you're starting. You need to start at Safa and go towards Marwa, and that counts as round number 1. Alright, it's sunnah to do all rounds together. So you're not going to do 3 rounds, take a break, and then do 4 more. And remember, the other thing is that sa'i is only performed after tawaf. There's no such thing as doing a nafl sa'i. So you can't just decide one day after prayer, I think I'm going to do 1 extra sa'i. Sa'i is an act that's only performed after tawaf. So it's a very limited act that has particular place within the sharia. Okay, so once you've completed that, which is not too difficult to comprehend, then the last thing you need to do is either shave your head or trim your hair. Now remember that if you're in ihram and you want to be released from that ihram, you have to do one of these 2 things. Either shave your head or trim your hair. So remember that if you're performing Hajj Qiran, the Hajj where you're connecting the Umrah and the Hajj in one ihram, you are not going to do this. Because you're going to leave that, you need that ihram now to go and do the Hajj. So you're not going to do anything to your hair. You're just going to be done with the sa'i and you'll wait and then head towards Hajj. So the way that you have to remove your hair is either by shaving, which is the best thing, because the Prophet ﷺ made dua for the people who shaved their hair 3 times. And after he made dua for the people who shaved their head, after he made dua for them 3 times, he then made dua for the people who trimmed their hair. Now, when you say trimming, what does trimming mean? Trimming has a very strict definition, a minimal definition. So the minimum of trimming is that you take 1 inch off every hair of the head. Okay? Basically, really what needs to be done is the minimum is 1/4 of the head. But the wajib, or a little bit more than that, is to do basically all areas of the head. So you want to take 1 inch off all the hairs of the head. If you're bald and there's no hair, then you just pass a razor over the skin, and that counts as releasing you from the ihram. Alright, for women, they're not going to shave. For them, what they'll do is they will take off 1 inch from each area of the head. So they'll take their hair and divide it into 3 sections, the left section, the right section, and the middle section. And then they'll take off 1 inch from each of the 3 sections. So they'll, for example, if this is one section, they'll just they'll grab the hair on that section and cut all the way across all the hair. So that'll take off 1 inch from that section. Now that should be done in private, right? And by a female or by a mahram. You'll see that people get very excited when they're doing the sa'i, and as you get to Marwa, at the very end, you'll see people are standing there lifting up their scarves and just cutting here. Or you'll see some person, he just cuts off a little bit here and he thinks he's done. So you'll see friends just doing this. They'll just cut off a little bit of hair and they'll throw it, and they'll start thinking that they're done with their cutting of the hair. It's got to be all over the head for a male, and for a female, you divide it into 3 and then cut off that 1 inch. All right. Once you trim, then the ihram is done. So all those prohibitions, no scent, no romance, no covering of the face, no covering the head, all that is over. Okay, so you're free, you're released. Okay, now a couple things, just additional points, is that number 1, tawaf and sa'i should be performed walking. So if you're unable, there are wheelchairs available, and it is permissible. For example, for handicapped people, and you'll see that you can actually hire people to take you around and do the tawaf or sa'i if the need exists. All right, that's the first thing. The second is that I told you that wudu is wajib for tawaf, but it's not necessary for sa'i. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And finally is, if you are doing tawaf or sa'i and you find yourself, you find that a fard or a janazah prayer begins, then all you'll do is basically stop that act where you are, and then join the prayer, and when the prayer is over, you'll get up and then continue. So let's say you're making tawaf, and as you're making tawaf, the adhan is called. You'll keep making tawaf, okay? You're not going to worry about the sunnah prayer. You'll just keep making tawaf. And then, when the iqamah is called, you'll stop. And right where you are, you'll line up for prayer, just right in front of the Kaaba. And then, as soon as the salam is stated by the imam, you'll be released, and then you'll just continue your tawaf. It'll be very obvious because everybody will be doing this together, so you won't be confused. And you'll just continue on with your deed as you were doing it. All right, now, once you've released yourself from the ihram, for most people from America who are going to be performing tamattu, you basically now have free time in Makkah Mukarramah. So you have some free time to do whatever you would like. Now, some things to keep in mind. Number one is be very adamant about getting every prayer in Jama'ah. It gets very easy to say, I'm tired, I need some rest, I'm going to stay at my hotel is maybe half a mile away, I don't really feel like walking. You know, these thoughts, they show up. You think from here that when I get there, that's it, I'm going to pray every prayer in the masjid. But shaitan is shaitan, these thoughts start coming in one's mind. So recognize that every single prayer in the haram, right, when you're praying with jama'ah, is actually worth 100,000 times what a normal prayer would be worth. And that applies to the fard prayers in jama'ah. So that's the first thing. The second thing you have to be careful about is intermixing during the prayers. Because it's so crowded that what ends up happening is that people just pray wherever they are. So if you're in the street, all right, and people and the iqamah is called, people just they have prayer rugs. They just throw the prayer rug on the floor and just start praying right there. And you'll see that for a mile back, you know, away from the marble of the masjid, people are just praying and filling up the streets. And what ends up happening is that the sisters are walking towards the masjid. They're coming from their hotels far away. And the brothers are walking towards the masjid, and they tend to pray. They tend to not separate themselves very well. So you need to be very careful that there's at least one body space between you and any woman that's also praying behind the same imam with the same niyyah. And technically, legally, the salah breaks if there's a woman next to you. So you'll see that any alim who goes is very careful. Before they make their takbir, they just look around them. They're very careful and analyze who's around them. And if not, they just move to another area, either to the edge of the street or some other area where they're surrounded by males. So be a little bit particular about this when during your prayers. All right, the other thing that as you're spending time in Mecca you want to remember is to avoid haram and do as much good as possible. Now you think, okay, what kind of haram am I going to do? I'm sitting in Mecca. Well, you know, what ends up happening is people go into the hotel room, and obviously it's a luxury hotel, so now they have TV hooked up with satellite. So what happens? You just say, well, I need a little bit of a break. Let me just put on for 5 minutes, right? 5 minutes becomes 10 minutes. 10 minutes becomes 10 wasted minutes. Who knows what you're watching on there? So just you know, unplug that TV the moment you walk into the room. That's the rule. When you get into that room, just take the TV and unplug it, and just assume that it's not there, because it will just be a huge distraction otherwise. So that's the first thing. The other thing that you have to watch out for is the cell phone. Now, what happens is many of these packages, they offer you a cell phone. And I think this mic is dead. We need a new battery. So many of these packages also offer a cell phone. So they say that for extra $100 we'll include a cell phone. Even if the cell phone is free, don't take it. It's not worth it. All right? Because there's really nobody you have to talk to. When you're in a state of ihram, and now you're going to mend your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the only one that you really need to communicate with is your Lord. This is not the time to worry about talking to people outside. And I would just leave the message with everybody at home That if you don't hear from me, everything's fine. If you hear something, that's when something is wrong. Otherwise, you're waiting in line for 3 hours to make phone calls and this and that, and really the focus is just going to be Allah. Just tell your family members, look, I'm going with a group of people. If you don't hear anything, that means everything is fine. And if you hear something, that's when the problem is occurring. So just make things very easy. You don't really need the cell phone there. And especially during tawaf and sa'i and these types of things, you'll see people will be making tawaf and the phone will ring and they'll pick it up. And they're talking as they're making tawaf. It's just such a strange sight. But you just want to try to avoid that. The other thing actually you want to avoid is you don't. If I were you, when I'm making tawaf, I would just keep my eyes down. Because then the other bad thing is that you see somebody talking on the phone and you start thinking, what is that person doing? Oh, this person has no idea what they're doing. Who are they to talk on a cell phone, right? Gosh, then you come home and tell everybody that these people are talking on a cell phone. So that also creates pride within a person's heart. So best thing, just look down and forget about everything. Okay, just think about you and Allah and your relationship with Allah. Alright, the other thing is that as you're in Mecca Mukarramah, spend as much time doing tawaf as possible. Because that's the one deed that you can't do anyplace else. So it's even better than nafl salah, because tawaf is the one thing you're not going to be able to do anyplace else. You can do nafl salah when you come back home. So it's recommended that you do as much tawaf as possible. But let me give you that recommendation with a caveat, and that is before the Hajj, I wouldn't engage in too many tawafs. You're going to get tired. You want to rest up. The one thing you don't want to start doing is performing extra umrahs and extra tawafs before you actually do the Hajj. It's very tiring. No matter what you think that, oh, I'm going to be able to handle it, I'm young, I'm energetic, I'm American, whatever you think, it's just not that way. You get very fatigued. Ask anybody who's gone. They thought that they would be fine, and often they get fatigued. So save up your energy for after the Hajj. Once you're done with the Hajj and you got the goal, that was why you went, then do all the umrahs you want. Do all the tawafs you want. Stay up all night if you want. But make sure that the Hajj is done properly. So I would get proper rest before you actually do the Hajj so you can do it with energy. Remember that even looking at the Kaaba is a form of worship. So whenever you can, just sit. If you're tired, just sit and stare at the Kaaba. That itself is a form of worship. And then what you want to do also in your free time is visit the graveyard of Mecca and visit other sacred places in Mecca. Alright, one thing that you should remember about Umrah is that Umrah has restrictions in its timing. Umrah can be performed any time during the year except the days of Hajj. So the actual days of Hajj, when you're going off and doing the Hajj, you cannot perform the Umrah. But people think that that's a great, you might think academically, that'd be a good time because everybody's gone in the desert, so now let me just sneak in and do a quick Umrah, right, before I go for doing my Hajj. Because everybody's gone anyway. Maybe you have a friend who has a car that can take you back for the Hajj. But that's not the time to do it. It's makruh tahrimi. So you're not supposed to do Umrah at that time. The days of Hajj are for the Hajj. Okay, the other thing is that when you're sitting in Makkah Mukarramah, if you happen to be there, it's that on the 7th of Dhul Hajj. The 7th of Dhul Hajj, after the Dhuhr prayer, the Imam will give a khutbah. So you'll see that people will sit down and the Imam will give a khutbah. And basically in this khutbah he describes the commandments of Hajj. He explains what the commands of Hajj are and what you're going to be doing. It's in the Arabic language, you probably won't understand it, but you should sit and listen attentively anyway. Because it's the Imam, there's a barakah in the words of the Imam, and even if you don't understand it, it's likely and hopeful that actually it will have some effect on your heart and it will make it easier for you as you perform the deeds and as you go through them. So sit and listen attentively out of respect of the fact that this is the Imam, number one. And number two, he's talking about such an important deed. And number three, he's talking to advise you. He's advising all the people there who are about to perform the Hajj. Okay, so that's the Umrah, and that's now complete. The last thing we want to talk about, at least this morning, are the different sites that you can visit when you're in Makkah Mukarramah. Okay, so one site that you can visit is the house of Hazrat Khadija radiallahu anha. This is the place where Fatima radiallahu anha was born, and it's also where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam stayed until the Hijrah. So you can get maps over there, and you'll be able to find this house, and you can go and visit this house. Okay, the other place that you can visit is the birthplace of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, actually, that place has been replaced by a library, and that library is at the foot at the base of a mountain called Jabal Abu Qubais. Now, I mentioned this mountain yesterday and told you some points about it, so let me just repeat those. Number one, this is the most sacred mountain in Mecca, and it's the highest mountain in Mecca. Number two, it's the first mountain that ever surfaced on the face of the earth. So the very first mountain that rose on the face of the earth was this mountain. Number three, when the flood came during the time of Nuh alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala entrusted this mountain with the black stone. The mountain was given the black stone, and it held the black stone until the Kaaba was rebuilt. And number four is that the Prophet ﷺ split the moon standing on this mountain. So you know the famous story where the Prophet ﷺ split the moon with his finger. So when he split the moon with his finger, he was standing on this mountain, and on this mountain, if you look carefully, there's a little white masjid. Okay, that little white masjid is called Masjid Hilal, because that's where the splitting occurred. Some people also call it Masjid Bilal, but it has two different names. But there's a little white masjid on that mountain. And at the base of this mountain is a library, and that library currently represents the birthplace of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, there's also the house of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. It's actually now replaced by a masjid that's called Masjid Abu Bakr. Why is it important? Because remember, the Prophet ﷺ used to go to that house twice every day. I don't remember if some of you may have been here when I gave this lecture, but previously I mentioned in one lecture a few years back that the Prophet ﷺ, he used to visit the house of Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anh 2 times every day, regularly, at the same time. So if the Prophet ﷺ would visit that house twice every day, don't you think it behooves us to visit at least once while we're in this vicinity on this great trip? So you should try to find that house and visit it, and again, it's available if you look at maps. Okay, then there's a place called Dar Arqam, and at Dar Arqam, that's the place where Hazrat Umar radiallahu anh converted to Islam. Now, later on, it was replaced by a masjid. First it was a house, then it was replaced by a masjid, and now it's actually incorporated into Safa wal Marwa. So there's no real place to visit there, but something to think about as you're actually making those circuits is that someplace in this vicinity is where Hazrat Umar radiallahu anh converted to Islam. So you can ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the same passion and fervor that you bestowed upon Hazrat Umar when he converted, Ya Allah, bestow that passion and fervor upon me as well as I pass by this place. So it's one more dua to keep in mind. Okay, then there's the famous graveyard of Mecca, which is called Ma'ala. Now in this graveyard, you have to remember a few things. Number one, this is the second most superior graveyard in the world. The first superior graveyard, the best graveyard in the whole world to visit is the one in Medina, and this is the second most. It's mustahab to visit it, and you should go there with proper etiquette. So let's mention a few of those etiquettes. Okay, so when you enter into this graveyard, you're going to make the following dua. Assalamu alaikum dara qawmin mu'minin. So, peace be upon you, O group of believers. This is basically what the translation is. وَإِنَّا إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ بِكُمْ لَاحِقُونَ. And we will, inshaAllah, be joining you shortly. Alright? And this actually, by the way, is the dua you make when you enter any graveyard. So this is just training. Alright? And then you're going to say, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for us and for you, protection, afiyah. So this is basically the dua that you make when you enter into the graveyard. This is a dua that you should memorize. Because you should be making an attempt to regularly visit graveyards, and you're going to start that habit hopefully on this journey, and then when you come back, you're going to visit the graveyard ideally once a week or at least once a month. Especially if you have a relative buried in the graveyard, you want to know the etiquettes of visiting the graveyard. Now once you get into the graveyard, then you're going to recite Surah Al-Fatiha, the first and last portions of Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Yasin, Surah Takathur, Ikhlas, if you have the ability to recite these surahs. And this is basically for the benefit of all the people buried in that graveyard. Now you're not going to sit on any grave, you're not going to walk on any grave, and you're definitely not going to offer any salah in the graveyard. And when you're making dua, you're not going to face a grave and make dua, you're going to face the qibla and make dua. And you're going to keep your hands lowered in order to make it very clear that you're not making any dua to a grave. Alright? Okay, then another place that you can visit is Jabal Thur. Now this is a mountain that's 3 miles away from Mecca. And this mountain is special because this mountain actually has multiple caves in it. But in one of those caves, the Prophet ﷺ and Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, they stayed for one night on their way to Medina when they were making the hijrah. And remember, this is the famous cave where the Prophet ﷺ and Hazrat Abu Bakr were in the cave, and then a spider came and spun a web on the outside of the cave, and then the pigeon came and laid some eggs over there. And so basically when the kuffar were searching for the Prophet ﷺ and Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, they were right there. They were literally standing at that cave, and they could see, Hazrat Abu Bakr could see the feet of the kuffar right there, about to have caught them. And then they started saying that, well, there's a spider web here, and there's these eggs here. There's no way the Prophet ﷺ would have disrupted this spider. I mean, there's no way he can be inside because, he would not disrupt the spider web. And they began to make excuses for why he could not be inside, but actually he was inside that cave. They were just listening to them making these statements. So this is a blessed place to visit, and you should make an attempt to visit it. And it can be visited, and there is a pathway up to visit this cave. All right, and then the other big cave that you want to visit is actually on another mountain called Jabal an-Nur. Jabal an-Nur is where the cave of Hira is located. It's about a mile away from Mecca. It's a very commonly visited place. All the taxi drivers know how to get there. It's often part of just a standard tour. Remember that this is the famous cave where the Prophet ﷺ often spent time in seclusion prior to his being crowned the prophethood and prior to his being given the first revelation. And then subsequently it was a place where he received the first wahi. So it's a very significant place historically in the deen, and it's a place to be visited. And again, when you get there, you're going to make dua that's appropriate for the location. Okay, so that pretty much is the end of what I wanted to say this morning. Okay, are there any questions on these two? Yeah, go ahead.
What's the significance of cutting the hair? Is that in our explained in our tradition? What's the?
I don't know what the significance of cutting the hair is, but you can think about it as, in a way, it sort of indicates your being a newborn. When you have a newborn, then you cut their hair. Mm-hmm. So in the same way, it sort of puts you back into that original state. The real significance is that's what the Prophet ﷺ did. But I don't know what the metaphorical meaning of that is exactly. Yeah. So the question is, if your beard is longer than a fist length, are you supposed to cut your beard? So it does come in hadith that some of the Sahaba used to, before they would go for Hajj, they would trim their beard to one fist length before they left for Hajj. But from that, basically, the ruling is taken that, that's a lot of rulings are taken from that hadith or from that statement of the companions. So if you desire to do that, you can. There's debate. There's debate as to what's mustahab. Some people believe that actually the beard should never be more than a fistful, and that actually is the ideal length. And another group of scholars believe no, that it should be extended beyond that. So there is some debate about that issue. Okay. So why don't you just take a few minutes to do whatever dhikr that you normally do in the morning, and then you can do the Ishraq prayer at 7:20, 7:21. So wait till 7:21, and then you can do the Ishraq prayer, inshallah.